Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bliss Center for the Performing Arts. Out of appreciation for the performers, respect for our fellow patrons, and your safety and enjoyment, we ask that you kindly observe the following. Kindly turn off all cell phones. Smoking in the building is strictly prohibited. Food and beverages are not allowed inside the theater. Take your time and move carefully, especially while on the second tier. Please do not interrupt performances. Please refrain from touching the decorations and art pieces on display. If a fire alarm is sounded, please do not run, but move swiftly towards the nearest lighted exit sign. When leaving the theater, please use only the doors clearly marked with lighted exit signs. Videotaping of the performances is strictly prohibited. Persons who wish to take still photos may only do so without flash. Thank you for your cooperation. Please sit back and enjoy the show.
A very good morning. Can you hear me at the top? Can I get a mic check? Oh, good. Good. Good morning, a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, students, teachers, our panelists, and to all Belizeans listening and tuned in on Love Radio and Television and Kerm Radio and Television. My name is Tanya Halls. I am here to welcome you to the second annual lecture series presented by the Belize History Association in collaboration with the National Celebrations Commission and IASCR and NICH. As September rolls around, I feel that we as Belizeans not only roll out the red, white, and blue, we roll out the patriotism, we roll out the national pride, and I think this particular year is an opportune year for the discussion we're having today on the Honorable Philip S.W. Goldson, Belizean patriot and national hero. I think, especially in light of what is happening with the Belize-Guatemala territorial dispute and the September celebrations, I think it is a wonderful opportunity for Belizeans and young and old, abroad and living here, to understand where Mr. Goldson stood in all of this, and that he was a true father of democracy for this country. In line with the Belize theme for this year, Belize renewed, confident, competitive, and committed. I think it is the only way forward is for us to know where we came from. So I'll hand over to you, to Mr. Jael August, to sing your national anthem. I ask that you please stand proudly, hands on hearts or at sides.
Of the free by the Carib Sea, our manhood we pledge to thy liberty. tyrants linger, despots must flee this tranquil haven of democracy. The blood of foresires which hollows the sod brought freedom from slavery, oppression's rod. By the might of truth and the grace of God, no longer shall we be hewers of wood. Arise, ye sons of the Bayman's Clyde, but on your armors clear the land, drive back the tyrants, let despots flee. Land of the free by the Carib Sea. Nature has blessed thee with wealth untold, our mountains and valleys where prairies roll. Our fathers, the Baymans, valiant and bold, drove back the invaders this heritage hold. From Rio Honda to Osastun, through Coral Isle over Blue Lagoon, keep watch with the angels, the stars and moon. For freedom comes tomorrow's noon. Arise, ye sons of the Bayman's Clyde, but on your armors clear the land, drive back the tyrants, let despots flee. Land of the free by the Carib Sea.
Thank you. I now call on Bishop Philip Wright to give the invocation. I ask that you remain standing, please, kindly.
Where is Bishop Philip Wright? And let's see his.
My apologies. I will hand you over to Reverend Goff. I understand Bishop Wright gives his apologies.
Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this special occasion on which we are met to celebrate our Belizean national hero, Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson. We thank you for him and for his example of his life, dedicated and committed to the highest ideals for this land. We thank you for the tradition in which he stood, for the things he defended, and for the way he was at times the very lone voice speaking out for what is right and pure and noble and good for Belize, our homeland by the sea. We thank you because, Lord, that tradition is indeed a rich one. A tradition that goes way back to our fathers and mothers who so bravely fought in the Battle of St. George's Key. We ask, oh Father God, that as we meet today, and as we remember the Honorable Philip S.W. Goldson, that we will truly be inspired by what we hear, by what is shared through the panel, from the discussions, that our hearts and our minds may be enlightened, and that together we may learn more of this great Belizean, this national hero, who continues to be and will forever be an icon for us in this blessed jewel called Belize. So, Father God, bless our panel as they share with us. Bless everyone present here. Especially, Lord, we give you thanks for the children and young people, the promise and the hope of this land. We pray, Father, that they too may benefit immensely from the discussion and the presentations this morning. And so we place ourselves and we place this gathering, this event, in your hands. Lord, take charge and have your own way. And may we go from this place stronger than how we came in. May we go forth in the true spirit of Philip S.W. Goldson, to live for this land, to defend this land, and to be dedicated to its development in the years to come. Hear us, O Father God, as we continue to trust you for all things. In the name of Jesus Christ, our blessed Lord and Savior, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Goff. I now invite to the podium Mr. Francis Humphreys, true Belizean historian and lecturer, to give the welcome remarks. Mr. Humphreys is also the chair of the Belize History Association, our recently established association, and he's our first president.
You're a problem, younger.
Good morning, everybody.
It's right there.
Put what?
It sounds weak. It's early in the day. Good morning, my fellow Belizeans. How are you this morning? Okay, that's so much better, huh?
I know represent, brother.
Such a delight to see our future Belizean leaders sitting in the audience.
Yeah, I did the interview.
Could you give them a very big round of applause?
Huh? Representing Miriam Muhammad.
I know.
And of course, the
Not
not so
representing
young
the
ones over
organization.
that side yonder and up yonder. Could we give them a big round of applause? Thanks for coming. It's important that you are here today. And of course, all the invited guests, a huge thank you on behalf of the Belize History Association for taking time out to come to this occasion this morning. It is an important occasion, as you will see in the course of the presentations, I'm sure. I also want to say a very special welcome to the Madam President of NICH, Diane Haylock. Could we give her a big round of applause? Okay. The History Association is an arm of NICH, and her continuous support, vision and mission of the Belize History Association. I also want to heartily welcome my colleagues and tireless workers in the Institute of Social Research. Nigel and his crew, where is Nigel? In Calada. He's up there. could we give Nigel, Rolando, and everybody else at ISCR, who are in fact the working arm of the Belize History Association. As a matter of fact, if you look up here, you will see for the first time our really nice emblem on display, public display. And I have to really not just welcome Nigel and his crew, but say a big public thank you for the tireless work that they have put into ensuring that the History Association grows from strength to strength. So once again, could we give them a very big round of applause? Now, before I officially welcome our really outstanding panelists who will talk about our Belizean national hero, Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson, I want to ask a question and see if somebody in the audience could answer it. When is the best time to save Belize, our country? When is the best time to save our country, Belize? I hear no, but if we use almost the exact words of Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson, what is it? Before we lose it. I wonder if the youngsters in the front here will remember that. I want your teachers to ask you a question after this. When is the best time to save our country, your country, before we lose it? That is just one tiny snippet of the wisdom that Stanley Wilberforce Goldson bequeathed to our nation. I am very confident that the panelists are going to add even more flesh to that storehouse of wisdom that still remains largely unrecorded. And as a history association, this event, I hope, will prod Belizeans who are competent to do so to write a definitive biography of our national hero, Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson. It's long overdue, and the time for doing it is now, not after we lose the memories that are so fresh regarding Philip Goldson. Having said that, it is with great pride and pleasure that I introduce to you and welcome them most heartily, the members of the panel who will help us once more to resurrect the memory of Philip Goldson and place it in the context that now is the time to save our nation, not after we have lost it. If I start with the ladies, we have on the panel Miss Maud Williams. Miss Maud, could you please stand so that we can acknowledge your presence? And could you give her a very big round of applause? Welcome, Miss Maud, and we thank you so much for agreeing to be here. We have Mrs. Gilda Lewis. Miss Lewis, could you please stand? Could we give her a big round of applause and say welcome and thank you so much, ma'am, for being here today. Okay. The moderator for the panel is Miss Anne Marie Williams. Miss Williams, could you please stand so that we welcome you and acknowledge your presence? And so I have taken care of the ladies and follow protocol that the ladies come first. Now we go to the honorable gentlemen. Right Honorable Manuel Esquivel, former leader of the United Democratic Party and the Prime Minister. Sir, welcome and thank you so much for being here. This is a man who knew Philip Goldson personally because Philip Goldson served in his cabinet. Am I right, sir? Yes. Okay. Next we have Mr. Nuri Mohammed, who again is no stranger. Sir, could you please stand? Welcome and thanks too for being here. Of course, Nuri is a very well-known television personality. And along with him, equally well known, is Honorable Hector Silva. Could you please stand, sir? Welcome, and thank you so much for being here today. So again, on behalf of the Belize History Association, we say welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to your sharing with us the essence of the man, the hero we call Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson. Let us enjoy, and youngsters, do take notes so that you can answer a few questions after the exercise. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Ms. Anne-Marie Williams, award-winning journalist, trained in radio, television, and print, the executive director of the National Women's Commission, to lead you into the roundtable discussion on the Honorable Philip S.W. Goldson, Belizean patriot and national hero. Ms. Williams, I invite you to the podium.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Sounded so much better. It is indeed a pleasure for me to have been asked to be here this morning, and I hope to do you proud. Rediscovering Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson, one of our two national heroes. He was born on July 25 of 1923, and he passed away on October 3 in 2001. Today, we will look at the life and legacy of such a great Belizean hero. This event today is a precursor to the opening of the Goldson House, which will take place on September 15 in Belmopan, and to which you're invited. To start us off this morning, let me just fill you in as to how we will proceed. This is actually a roundtable discussion with the 5 panelists. We will be discussing all aspects of his life, like I said before. We will also share a couple interview clips with you. And there will be a section at the last portion for comments and questions on Philip Goldson. So sit back, relax. I'm sure you all brought your books and your pens for note-taking, because this is an important history lesson for all ages. So thank you very much, and help me welcome the panel once again. To my immediate left, I have a very important woman. Her name is Maud Williams, and she's the sister of the late Philip Goldson. I will talk to her a little bit about his life and his legacy. Miss Maud, good morning.
Good morning.
Tell us a little bit about the brother you had in the person of Philip Goldson, the brother and good son.
For me to do that, to tell you about Philip's early life, because that's what I know best. We grew up in the area that people call nowadays Majestic Yard. We were a large family, 5 boys and 2 girls. My father was a clerk at John Harley and Company. He worked very hard there and moved up in the company until later he became the manager of the lumber yard. The lumber yard was across the street where Brody's store is now. My father was also involved in rearing of chickens. And because he had so much work to do, my brothers had to help him with rearing the chickens. Of course, my brothers used to go downstairs and help with the rearing of the chickens, but my mother drew the line and said, my 2 daughters are not going down there. You know, my father had a huge incubator that held 300 eggs. And I can remember clearly when he set up that incubator with the eggs, he had to put lanterns in the incubator to give it the heat that it needed for the eggs to hatch. And he would monitor that thing every day. Every day he would monitor that incubator to make sure that everything was going right. He would spend time, sometime turning the eggs and so on. And I can always remember, I used to say, why is it that these chickens wait until early morning to hatch? Because early one morning we would hear peep, 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 and my father would jump up and go to that incubator and start taking out the chickens. My brothers then would have to help him with taking them out and getting them downstairs into the coops that he had downstairs for the chickens. But that was not all that my brothers did. He had those chickens, but he had other chickens downstairs that were grown chickens. And they had to get down there and help him with that. But when I say chickens, it wasn't just ordinary chickens. He only reared special breed chickens. He used to rear white leghorns. He used to wear Dominicas and Rhode Island Reds. And it was like a religion with him. He took care of those chickens. One of the things I remember clearly was that at a certain time in the year, they used to have an exhibition, just a show of the chickens up at the fort in the area where it used to be the custom shed. And he would get up early in the morning, wake my brothers, get them downstairs. The white leghorns, he would bathe the white leghorns, get them ready, and they would take them up to the fort. He won many, many prizes for the chickens that he raised. But it wasn't only putting the chickens on show. They had to do a lot of work. They had to help him cut up the food to serve to the chickens, plantain skin, coconut trash, all sorts of things, mixed together, any food that was left from the table. And he also gave them corn. He had a huge mill where he would crack the corn and mix it in and feed the chickens. And as I said, that was from early morning until time for my brothers to run upstairs, get their breakfast, and get to school. But it was a good life. We were happy, and everybody helped with what needed to be done. My brothers downstairs and the two girls upstairs with my mother.
Miss Maud, I remember in our conversation, chatting this weekend, we spoke, besides helping the family and doing a lot of the physical work and chores, you told me that Philip actually sent you to school, to high school. Tell us a bit about that.
Philip was a phenomenal brother. In the days when we were growing up, it was difficult for children to get off to high schools. I spent all my primary school years at St. Mary's. And when I reached standard 6, there was nothing else for me to do. I would have gone home and just sat home. But my mother said, you're going back for another year. So I was in standard 6 for 2 years. By this time, Philip was working. And one day he came home and said, I brought this for you, and he handed me a form. And I said, what is this for? And he said, read it. So I read the thing, and it was an application for St. Hilda's College. Now, I think the natural question people would ask, how you're going to St. Hilda's College? Or I would ask, but it never dawned on me to ask. Philip said, I'm going to St. Hilda's College, so I am going to St. Hilda's College. And he sent me to St. Hilda's College. And I spent all my secondary school at St. Hilda's College. But I was not the only one that he sent to St. Hilda's College. I had a younger brother, Eric, right after me, and he was lucky to get a government scholarship. But it was just the school fees to pay, and Philip found everything else. I was already in school. He found everything else for my brother to go to high school. He went to St. Michael's College. And then later, my sister Patricia also got a scholarship. And again, Philip found everything for her to go to high school. And we continued there at high school. And then my younger brother, Peter, Philip sent him to SJC. And also my niece, Greta, he also sent her to high school. So that was 5 of us. He paid our way to high school. So you can understand why I say he was a phenomenal brother.
I was saying to Miss Maud that of late, when you have a family of a number of children, sometimes the elder brother or the elder sister would move out the household and not help at home and leave the family to struggle. But Philip didn't do that.
He didn't do that. And what is so important is that Philip did not get an opportunity to go to high school. He could not go to high school because my parents just could not afford to send him to high school. But we had a headmaster at St. Mary's School, Robert Smith, who told my mother, send him back to St. Mary's School, and I will help him. And my mother sent him back, and Mr. Smith had Philip help in the classrooms around the school during the day. I don't think anybody, but I think Mrs. Lewis will remember that they used to call him Master Philip. And in the evening after school was out, Mr. Smith tutored him. And after like 2 years, he sent him to take the junior overseas exams.
That was the Cambridge.
The Cambridge exams, and he passed the exam. It was like Christmas Day at St. Mary's School. Everybody was so happy. And, and what was so important for them, it's from St. Mary's School. He didn't go to high school. So, and then after he passed the junior Cambridge, he got a job with government as a messenger. And he worked there for a while. And then Mr. Smith said, come back, get some leave and come back. And he went back, and again Mr. Smith tutored him, and he took the senior Cambridge exam and also passed that. So that was how he got like a secondary education. And I think that must what have helped him to see the importance of education and making sure that his brother, his sisters, and his niece and nephew and his brother also got a secondary education.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maud. He never only sought to try to educate himself, but also his family. Let us look at about 2 minutes of a clip that was done back in 1998 when a group of Belizeans did a tribute to the late Philip S.W. Goldson. The tribute took place right here at, It was the Bliss Institute, the precursor to this Bliss, in 1998, and one of the speakers was Nicholas Pollard Sr. Let's take a look.
Who was Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson? Undoubtedly, time has shown he was a Belizean hero, a true patriot. As the nation mourns his passing, we look back at the life of Philip S.W. Goldson with a few of the people whose lives he has touched along the way. Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson was born
Just a
on
minute,
25th
this
of
is,
July
this is the wrong clip. It's the clip with Nicholas Pollard Sr. speaking about Philip Goldson.
By private study, he obtained the Cambridge University Overseas Junior Certificate in 1939 and the Senior Certificate in 1941. Historian Nicholas Pollard Sr. gives us his impressions.
First time I heard of Philip was when he was with then Mr. Joseph Blackett, who founded something called the British Honduras Debating and Literary and Debating Society. And then they started working for something called the Belize Bill Board, owned by Narciso Valdez, called Nacho. And Goldson wrote for it mostly about labor. But how I got to know him physically was when he joined something we had in Belize going already under the president of St. John's College, Father Edward J. O'Donnell, president of St. John's College, started a group of us Catholic young men to study what we call the papal encyclicals about labor, credit unions, and that sort of thing. And apparently Narciso, being a Catholic, brought in Goldson and Richardson into the picture. And in fact, they became converted to the Catholic Church, both men. And so Goldson became even more interested in labor unions after we started studying that. Price was also a member of the group. But along came the devaluation of the dollar on the 31st of December 1949. And Goldson became a reporter to our group. He began to report to what this group called the People's Committee was doing, with John Smith as leader, George Price as secretary, and I became the president of the General Workers' Union by this time. In March of 1950, I became general secretary, and Goldson became assistant secretary to me. And then in same year, 1950, 29th of September, he was elected assistant secretary to George Price, who became secretary to the new People's United Party. He started writing very anti-colonial articles, and in 1951, sometime around August, the governor demanded an apology for what he'd written. He and Richardson, both of them, demanded an apology from both of them. In 1956, we split. Goldson went one way with Richardson and Pellegrini.
Nicholas Pollard Sr. there, giving a bit of background about Philip Goldson. Mr. Silva, as a member of the Legislative Assembly at that time, when Philip Goldson served as the lone voice in the House, tell me a little bit about what you remember about the man.
First of all, students, welcome to this panel discussion. Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson is not the owner of the Belize Airport. The Belize Airport was named in his honor for the great work he has done, because they have been asking other high schools, who was Philip Goldson? Oh, he said he owned one airport. No, that was named in his honor. I met young Philip Goldson at the battlefield in Belize City. Battlefield is in by Brody there. On January the 6th, 1950, when the People's Committee addressed the people on the devaluation of the British Honduras dollar on December 31st, 1949. On the 6th, these young men met and they began a heavy protest, which eventually became the movement of independence. And I will give to Nietzsche something that Belizeans have not seen before. And these are the 5 founders of the movement of independence that everybody should know. These were our liberators, founding fathers of the nation of Belize. So I will give it to Mr. Nigel and Calada. Maybe they can put it at Mr. Goldson's house over there. Yes. On the right here is Mr. George Price, who was 31 years old. On the left was Mr. Goldson, who I think was about 28 or 29 years old. On the extreme left, Mr. Lee Richardson, who was also once a leader of the movement of independence called PUP. The middle one was Mr. John Smith, the first leader of the movement of independence. And on the right, Mr. Nicholas Pollard, who was 27 years old, almost as the age of the students today in high schools.
And you just heard the voice of Nicholas Pollard Sr.
What a brave crowd of young people, no? I'm not orating about in those days. So I will give this to Nietzsche. Then we continue. Thereafter, I met young Philip. I was a student at St. John's College, and we met very frequently. I became a political bug. I wanted to know more about my country. So these were the men that knew, because the colonial people would not tell us. They told us his story, their story, not our story. And these people were giving our story. So I became involved. Then I recall when Mr. Goldson and Mr. Richardson were tried for sedition in the Supreme Court because of an article they wrote in the Belize Billboard under the caption, 7 Days of Freedom. Now, you all students should know that address by Mr. Goldson and Mr. Richardson. You should know. That gave us a picture comparing British Honduras to our neighbors around that had universities, had highways, had electricity, had water. So that's all they did. They went to buy newspaper material in Guatemala. But on their way back, they wrote this article and they told the Belizeans what they had found in Guatemala. Yet Belize didn't have a road to Cayo, didn't have a road to Punta Gorda, nor Dangriga, nor nowhere. So this is what they called, they accused them of treason. Imagine, when they were actually defending. So I met him there, and this article was brought, and they were sent to prison. But having found out that actually it was an injustice they did, they released them. And so this also is a picture when they were released in an old federal truck. There is Mr. Goldson, there is Mr. Richardson, an old 2-ton federal truck, which were the trucks in those days, no? They never have them big truck here. So this also goes.
Let me just say that he was sentenced to 1 year hard labor.
Yes, that's
for
right.
seditious intention, and it was all because of the article, like Mr. Silva said, that suggested that there are 2 roads to independence: evolution and revolution.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Correct. Now, fast forward to 1954. when Belize got adult suffrage, means everybody can vote from 20 years up without the requirements of property and wealth and the rest. So Mr. Goldson, along with 6 other members, won an election, the first election to the Legislative Assembly, and he was appointed as a member of Social Services, corresponding to minister today. And among the many things that Mr. Goldson said and did was the rebuilding of Corozal Tongue that was totally destroyed by Hurricane Janet. So Mr. Goldson, Philip, a member, was actually the architect of the rebuilding of Corozal Tongue. And I think Corozaleños should know this too, because he stood there with them along with Mr. Henry Fiaweda until Corozal was built back. Now we go further, and I always try to get fast forward, no? Mr. Goldson in 1961 was appointed by Governor Thornley to be the solo member in the House of Representatives, the Lone Ranger. And he stood there as that factor that is called democracy. He was there to support that. Mr. Goldson served in that elected position for the Albert until he died. He was loved by the Albert, the Belize, of course, but by that division, nobody wanted Mr. Goldson to be removed. That's why I have suggested that that bust that is under that arch over there should be brought right in front of the Supreme Court, because they were the first and only 2 people that went to prison for politics in defense of Belize. The only 2, Goldson, Richardson. So that memorial should be facing the Supreme Court there.
Mr. Silva, tell us a bit, because of
Yes,
time,
I
tell us a
will.
bit of the years between 1961 and 74
Okay.
during the House.
So,
what
during
was some
that
of the
period,
situations like?
Mr. Goldson actually was one of those people that was very jealous of our identity, of our country, of our territory. Mr. Goldson also participated strongly in the labor movement of this country. That's where they came from protecting the laborers in the General Workers' Union. Then, this is one of the points that each and every Belizean should know. They had a conference in Puerto Rico, whereby a suggestion was made by the British and Americans that Belize must surrender to Guatemala a portion of the southern part of Belize. Mr. Goldson, on hearing that, walked out of the conference, came back to Belize, went to the courthouse plaza, and he revealed what was occurring. Thereafter, Mr. Price made also a statement saying that he told them not 1 square centimeter of land shall we give Guatemala. Mr. Goldson answered, and not even a blade of grass. And finally, Mr. Goldson, you all know, there are many pictures, always led parades throughout Belize and the country. We no want no Guatemala, meaning we will not surrender to Guatemala. Great hero. And then, because of his constant warning in the House, and it is recorded, he kept telling us that we had to build a strong army. We took it as a joke. In those days, you know, politics, you play in the House. But he was serious. He was prophetizing what was to come ahead. And then, the famous words of Mr. Goldson that should be in every school: the time to save your country is before you lose it. Before you lose it. So, a year ago, I got a call from a good friend of mine named Mr. Ned Pitts. He said, Mr. Hector, I was in Salinas. He said, Mr. Hector, I had 10 years ago you made a statement about Mr. Goldson should be called the father of patriotism and democracy in Belize. I said, yes, I said it. He said, please, he said, repeat it again. So I am repeating it here. He's somewhere sitting there. He called me just now to tell me. Mr. Ned, please.
It's right near the door.
Remind me the. And so I am telling you all here, these panelists and the students, I would like in the new building that they will have, the Goldson House, that some inscription be made that Mr. Goldson was the father of patriotism and democracy in Belize, as Mr. Price was the father of the nation, and add on somewhere that Mr. Goldson was Belize's patriotic prophet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Silva. When we come to former Prime Minister Esquivel, we will talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of his patriotism and democracy. Our next panelist is Nuri Mohammed, and Nuri will talk a little bit about when he first met Philip Goldson and his importance in the diaspora. Nuri?
Good. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and welcome to all, especially the students. As I look out at the audience, which is, I would say, 99.9 young people, all that we are saying here today should in fact relate to you, even though we have an audience in TV and radio land. We are speaking specifically to our young people today. And I would want you, as a young person, to reflect on the importance of Mr. Goldson. The reason I say that is because in 2015, if I ask you to raise your hand if you know who is Beyonce, put up your hand. All right, if I ask you who is LeBron James, put up your hand. If I ask you who is Minnie Minaj?
Nicki Minaj.
If I ask you who is Nicki Minaj, put up your hand. All right, good. That's my point to you. You know all of these.
Pop stars.
Some people may call them heroes. I don't call them heroes.
Pop stars and celebrities.
Yeah. But you don't know a person who you should know intimately, and that is the Honorable Philip Goldson. This is not an ordinary man, and particularly for young people who are struggling today, to have an iconic figure like Mr. Goldson in your life that you could reflect on as you struggle forward. You need to know as much as you can about him. All that you've heard today and will be hearing today is about a person who became famous even before he was 21 or 22 years old. He was a hard-driving individual, pulling himself up, as Miss Maud said. There was no silver spoon in his mouth. There was no extra special anything for him except the discipline of hard work, the discipline of belief, the integrity that he had, and the kind of heart that I came to realize that Mr. Goldson had, which was a very soft heart. And I'm glad, Miss Ma, that you, because I knew how much he took care of his family, but I didn't realize that he sent all of them through school, which is a great, great thing for any young person to turn back and want to help his young brothers and sisters to make it through school. How many of us are like that today? Again, Mr. Goldson, in my mind, was a visionary. And he was a visionary in three specific areas. I will confine my focus because of the shortness of time. Mr. Goldson was a man who, from my reflection on his life, was a person of great conviction and believed in what he believed in and stood firm for that. When I got the honor of interviewing him in 1992, and we were going over his life, and he told me about the circumstance of him and Mr. Richardson ending up in jail, I recognized then and there that Mr. Goldson was our only political prisoner. He and Richardson, in fact, were like Nelson Mandela. They went to jail not for committing a criminal act in the sense of harming anybody, but they went to jail for standing up for their conviction against a very powerful enemy, which was the British at the time. We may not want, in this narrative that we have been running all these years, to look at the British as an enemy, but if you go back and look at how the young movement was looking at the government at that time, they in fact were not looking at them as friends. They were looking at them as obstacles in a process of self-determination and eventual independence. Mr. Goldson and Mr. Richardson went to jail for 1 year hard labor. Mr. Price was also charged with sedition during that period, but didn't go to jail. Evan Hyde and Ishmael Shabazz was also charged with that same law of sedition, but were freed of that charge and did not go to jail. I'm saying that because we brush over the history of our heroes and spend deep time researching frivolous, unimportant, iconic people that are put in front of our young people as heroes. You need to know who a real hero is. A person who is willing to stand for what he believes in and does not falter because the wind seems to be blowing in another direction. In 1980s, Mr. Goldson, in Mr. Esquivel's government, stood up and sounded the alarm of the open-ended policy that we seem to have been following at that time of allowing as many Central American immigrants to come into the country almost seemingly unchecked. As I look at what is going on in Europe today and the crisis that they are facing with human beings running from conflict and trying to find refuge in areas where their families will be safe, it's a very similar situation that we were facing in the 80s as people were running from Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, seeking refuge in Belize. The history says that they started a movement that became unmanageable, and eventually the government had to summons the assistance of the UNHCR, the agency in the UN responsible for refugees.
Which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
And that group there facilitated a process which Mr. Goldson began to indicate very early, and is in this interview which I did with him, that we are being overwhelmed. In the late 80s, he was saying that the unofficial figure at the time was over 66,000 in a small population where we had not even reached 300,000 in our whole population. Clearly, when he spoke to me in 1992 and brought up this subject again, he said, it is far gone from that figure. Now, that interview was done 30 years ago. And we look and we see the total demographic change that has taken place in Belize, which Mr. Goldson was courageous enough to stand up and question at the time, to say, we need a policy here. And that seems to be what the Germans, the Americans, the British, and all of them are saying. It's not that we don't welcome these people because they're running, but we have our own socio-economic circumstances to look at before we have an open door policy. We did that in Belize, but clearly we did not do that sufficiently. Lastly, because I know our time is running out, just let me finish by saying two other areas of vision. I'm saying he was a visionary then in looking and seeing something that will eventually affect us. He was also a visionary when it came to, as Mr. Hector brings out, the Guatemalan issue. I think Mr. Goldson had a line in the sand policy when it comes to Guatemala. And as we are seeing the current circumstances today surrounding the SARS-2, bringing back that same kind of gut reaction. I love the homily that Mr. Bishop Wright wrote in the Amandala this week in regards to understanding how important patriotism is and putting it within a context. We should not be dividing ourselves during this time, and Mr. Goldson was a man who stood up and said, let us not divide ourselves, let us not break ourselves down. And so today, the territorial volunteers would all be behind a man like Mr. Goldson, or maybe I should put it the other way around. It is Mr. Goldson and that spirit that would be leading that charge today.
You have 2 minutes to wrap up, because I want to show a piece of the clip.
Clearly.
So,
all right. Okay. Well, live is better than the clip. So I'll close by saying the last area where I think Mr. Goldson's visionary area is yet to be fulfilled, and that is the incorporation of the diaspora, the many thousands of Belizeans, which has probably reached well over 100,000 in the United States, being involved in the actual process of Belizean development. They are already involved, but Mr. Goldson's vision was that they be involved right up to voting. And he brings that clear in this interview which we did, that Belizeans abroad should find a way in which they are also participating in the governance process. Those are the three areas. And along with that, of course, Mr. Goldson went back to law school in his 50s. Am I right, Mr. Ahmad? He became an attorney even though he was blind. So he was a visionary for not only political areas, but certainly the village council, as you brought up, and so many other areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nuru Mohammed. Let's give him a round of applause, please. We will use the clip to encapsulate the whole discussion at the end. And speaking from where you left off, talking about some of the late Philip Goldson's accomplishment, yes, indeed, he was very instrumental in the whole village council rural development movement. And he also established the Department of Patriotism. I'm not sure how many of you knew that there was a Department of Patriotism, but there was a Department of Patriotism right at the 4th Street area, right near the old Customs House. And he actually established that while he was minister in the Ministry of Social Development. And Mr. Esquivel is the ideal person to elaborate on some of those things. He was also one of the fighters for women's rights, way long before it was actually popular. Mr. Goldson now, from Right Honorable Manuel Esquivel's perspective. Mr. Esquivel, thanks for coming, and tell us, I know there's lots to tell, but you'll have to condense it. I want to talk about, you were one of the founders of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party and the People's Democratic Movement and the NIP came together, merged, and formed what is today known as the United Democratic Party. Tell us a little bit about Philip Goldson's involvement in those movements.
Okay, well, first of all, good morning. Let's switch. Thank you. Good morning. There we go. It's okay. Well, we'll try this one. There we go.
Yes, good.
I wanted to take a little bit of a different tact as it is with regard to Mr. Goldson, because while I do not mean to disrespect any of these people here, you need to be reminded that I was only 9 years old when these things were happening. Okay. Nevertheless, I can remember explicitly the devaluation, because even as a 9-year-old child, I painted a rough banner to put on a little old car that we had to go in the parade that was held in opposition to this. But I did not really get to know Mr. Goldson then. But later on, as things progressed politically, it became a matter of importance to everyone, regardless of their political feelings. The whole political movement was something of constant discourse, not only in the streets and on the rostrum, but in the homes, etc., because an evolution was taking place. In that regard, one of the things that I think we have missed up until now is that Mr. Goldson started out not so much as a politician, but as a labor leader. Mr. Goldson was perhaps the principal person responsible for the formation of the General Workers' Union. And the General Workers' Union, which had a great following, became the vehicle for the movement of the People's United Party. That is, all of the throngs of people following behind the People's United Party were in fact people who had been unionized by Mr. Goldson. So I would dare to say that if it were not for the General Workers' Union, the PUP may never have taken root. But he did it, and I remember hearing his stories. He, I believe, traveled principally in the south, the west, and the north, in the places such as Dangriga and in Benqueviejo and in Orange Walk, where he recruited leaders for the labor movement. Mr. Nacho, Vega, Mr. Nacho Vega in Orange Walk, who later became a mayor of the town of Orange Walk. Mr. Arzu in Dangriga, who also was one of the first people to win a seat in the National Assembly who was not a PUP. And also in the West, Mr. Gueramena,
Pedro Gueramena.
Pedro Gueramena, who, by the way, I think I can get an agreement here that he was a marvelous orator in the Spanish language. He could really move mountains, and he did.
And former mayor.
Yes. And then in the South, yes, Mr. Murray, who came out of the South, and he became also one of the first people to be elected as an NIP from the Toledo district. Also, he became a mentor of mine when I first got into politics, because by then he had moved to Belize City, and he was like a campaign manager of mine in the Caribbean Shores Division. So it was a great loss when he died to the movement. But I would think that, therefore, Mr. Goldson's contribution, aside from the political history which has been told, was his contribution to the labor movement and the role that that movement played in fortifying the political movement. I don't hear anybody really making references to that nowadays, but it is very, very important. Because before that, there were no labor unions to speak of, and of course, it caused a lot of unrest. There was a great turmoil with the Belize Estate and Produce Company in those days, and all of these things were things that led up to the creation of the People's United Party. So even though he was never a leader in the party, I mean the leader in the party, he was in fact the person who I think gave birth to the party. And I'm glad that mention was made of his being put in jail for sedition. And not just going to jail to sit there for a time. He was made to do hard labor. This is a young man who did not ever do hard labor.
Commit a crime.
And it was not today a crime. So can you imagine one of you out there among the boys coming out of high school and then going to jail to do hard labor? So hard labor for him must have been double what it would be for a person used to working hard on the streets. But he bore it, and he never complained afterwards about it.
His going to jail may have been a blessing in disguise to a number of the prisoners, because he used to teach the prisoners to
Yes.
read and write within the confines of the prison. And part of that actually came out when he used to get the billboard written, albeit he was in prison, because the cooks and some of the people in the prison used to smuggle out the stories on toilet paper, the notes, and take it to the billboard to get it printed, albeit he was in prison.
Right, and again, the Belize Billboard was one of the great moving forces in consolidating this movement.
Right.
So even though he had broken away from the PUP, and much of his writings were about the dangers which he saw in the PUP of establishing a dictatorship, nevertheless, the Belize Billboard was a powerful force in the general political development of the country.
Ms. Maud wanted to elaborate on something.
I just want to say that while Philip was in prison, his younger brother, Lindbergh, was the one who kept the billboard going while Philip in prison, and he stayed with Philip after that until he went away to the United States. I think it was 1962. But he stayed with Philip. When he was in prison, he kept that billboard going, and it was there for Philip when he came out of prison.
Can I also make a note? I just wanted to, excuse me. I just wanted to make, go back. I just wanted to make note of the fact that the Belize Billboard was and still is the only daily paper that Belize has ever had.
Good point.
Well,
So
not-
many
not-
years later.
Is, but not was. The
Was,
Daily Clarion.
because the Clarion was also, yes.
Clarion.
But,
Yes.
but that's an aside.
Go ahead,
But
Mr. Esquivel.
so powerful a force was it that it occurred to someone on this day, until now nobody knows, to burn it down. At that time, it was on Freetown Road, corner of Pickstock Street. Barrack Road and Pickstock Street. And that was never solved, but it was completely destroyed. But nevertheless, it survived because of the tenacity of Mr. Goldson. One of the things that I learned about him as I grew older and got to know him in politics was his tenacity. There are times when it was even infuriating, when he would hold on to a bone and he would not let it go. So, but nevertheless, it is that tenacity which won him the admiration of so many people in Belize and respected him, and why the people in the Albert Division voted for him time and time again. Mr. Goldson was a person who I really only got to know after he became a member of the UDP. Because prior to the formation of the UDP, as was said, he had gone to become a lawyer in England. And unknown to most people, he was already growing blind. So that by the time he returned to Belize as a lawyer, he was totally blind, although nobody could detect it because of the courage that he had to continue on in his work as a politician. And it is that kind of tenacity that caused his tenacity in standing up to the British, later on standing up to the PUP, and at times standing up to the UDP.
His blindness also to Mr. Esquivel, the same thing that catapulted him to glory and maybe for the want of a better word, fame, also turned around too to hurt him in part because there were some people around him who took advantage of his blind state.
Well, yes, that was a great pity. And because he became dependent on these people as confidants, it is my view that they took advantage of that situation. And the one which you were, I say involved in, not in the sense
I actually covered the story at Channel 5, yes.
He was accused of issuing passports
and work permits.
Which was a great injustice because, as I said, by then he was totally blind. And some of the people around him, it is my conviction, would just get him to sign these things with him having full faith in them that it was legitimate. But nevertheless, he is the one that took the blame rather than them. And I would like that history should correct that because it was totally unfair. And people still refer to it today as if it were the truth, and it is not.
Speak to some of his accomplishments in terms of the areas that he's established in terms of the patriotism department under your leadership too.
Well,
when he was
certainly
the Minister of Social Development.
His focus was very definitely people-oriented. Again, not so much political advancement, but people advancement.
Social advancement.
So when he became a minister, he kept with that kind of portfolio for the development of people, social services. One of the things he created is a family court. And why would he do that? Because prior to that, people with family disputes had to go to an open magistrates' courts and bear their troubles to the general public. He saw that this was an injustice and discouraged people from standing up for their rights. And so he created the family court so that people would not be exposed to public view in discussing their family problems. I think that was a great, great contribution. There are times I hear today where it is not working properly because of bureaucratic mishaps and so on. But certainly that was not his intention. His intention was to make sure that people in sad family instances would not have to bare their souls to the general public. He also,
Village council.
with the village council, he created that system, and later on he worked very, very much with the alcalde system in the south. And that was a great movement because the people at that time in Toledo were very proud of these honors of being alcaldes, but nobody really was even aware of their existence until Mr. Goldson gave them prominence and set up rules and regulations under which they would function. So his focus was always on people with disabilities. He worked very, very hard, certainly, obviously, with people who had problems with their eyesight, but not only that, he worked with all kinds of disabilities in trying to better the lives of people and make it possible for people to live a real life in spite of their disabilities, and which he showed by his own example. I find it terribly difficult to understand, let alone believe, how he could accomplish so much and fight so hard as a person who was totally blind in a country which was not developed to the sense of recognizing that people with disabilities not only had rights but could achieve very many things. So I think that alone should make him a national hero, that he took these people in the darkness, not only just of their eyesight, their hearing, their ability to walk or whatever. He took them out of the darkness and, well, literally gave them light.
Literally and figuratively.
Right.
Yes. It is important to say here that although Mr. Goldson ran the Albert division and it was his stronghold and was always vote, 1993 was his last election in the Albert division when he won, and he came to power on a coalition government with the UDP. I want you to zero in on that and what triggered that to have happened, and so we need to talk now a little bit about the Maritime Areas Act, which actually, the controversial Maritime Areas Act, which actually caused the disagreement and caused him to break away and form the National Alliance for Belizean Rights prior to making up and forming the coalition government.
Okay, very good, because that's an important aspect of our development. I have sitting next to me
Right.
one of the territorial volunteers of the day.
She said, no.
Anyway, these are people who are very firm in their convictions, and they saw the Maritime Areas Act as a dilution of our territorial integrity.
Speak a little bit about
Yes.
what the act was.
Right, well, that is the great pity. I don't think any person in the audience today even has a concept of what it
Right.
was.
Listen up, students.
What it was an important step in defining Belizean territory and its limitations. And we grew up with the British having decided that in the south, where Toledo meets the Sarstoon, that there would be a median line, should I say artificial line? Well, but that is the right word.
That is it. That is it.
Yeah, you go.
It is a geographic.
You go into the sea.
It is a
and
real term. It's artificial.
You go
yes.
in the sea and there's no line,
Yes.
but there was
Yes.
an artificial line drawn by the British, which said to the north of it was Belizean territory, to the south of it, Guatemalan territory. But then came along the formation of the International Law of the Sea. This is a United Nations body, just like the International Court of Justice, etc., which defined how maritime areas were to be delineated, not just in Belize, internationally.
Over the world, yeah.
And in fact, since then, many of the court cases which go to that court are about sea boundaries. And so it was in Belize. And the Maritime Areas Act, in my opinion, and in many others in the party, was in fact in compliance with the International Law of the Sea. But the International Law of the Sea defined how these imaginary lines were to be drawn based on the territorial, the physical land territorial configurations. So it was not a straight line, but it was a line which would go, we actually gained some territory there from 3 miles to 12 miles. And so now we enjoy a 12-mile sea limit. And it also gave us 12 miles around all of the keys. So it was an international law, but our law until then had been 3 miles on this artificial boundary. But because people were wedded to that, and they saw a change as a threat to our territorial integrity. I did not see it that way, but Mr. Goldson saw it that way, and I'm sure some people in the panel today saw it that way. As a result of that, Mr. Goldson decided he could not support it, and he broke away. But due to the efforts of many stalwarts of the party, Mr. B.Q. Pitts, being a principal one, became negotiators and were able to persuade Mr. Goldson that it is best that at least for the purposes of voting in the House, he should form a coalition. And that is what happened before the following election, and we were able to win.
That gave the United Democratic Party the victory in 1993. So it was a UDP neighbor coalition. Right. Mr. Esquivel, thanks a lot, and I know we will get some more from you as we come to Dr. Lewis. Let's give Right Honorable Manuel Esquivel a hand. Dr. Lewis is actually one of the founding members of NABER, which is the National Alliance for Belizean Rights. Back in history, every time Mr. Goldson had a disagreement, I usually say when he broke away, he formed his own party. As a result of breaking away, he formed NABER. And Dr. Lewis is one of the ideal persons to speak now about the UDP NABER situation and what it meant. Dr. Lewis?
Good morning, all. I need to dispose of a few misconceptions.
Go ahead.
Before I get into what I need to say. The Maritime Areas Act did not follow the UN Law of the Sea because that talks about the median line. And we restricted ourselves to 3 miles in the south, and that is what Mr. Goldson was very much against. If anyone who studies how the law of the sea works, when there is a dispute, it's not a straight line down the middle. It depends on your coastline, and they have to triangulate this and that and the other. But not one settlement has gone to any 3-mile limit anywhere, right? So that is not the law of the sea, number one. When Mr. Goldson was a minister in government the last time, Mr. Charles Hope was given a government appointment to be his eyes,
Right.
to make sure that what he was signing, he knew what he was signing. Now, when he went to sign, you had to put his finger on the spot where he was supposed to sign, and he signed. But if you look at his signatures, they all go a bit up.
Yes,
Because
that's right.
he wasn't seeing, he was signing his name. Coming to that, I was a child at St. Mary's when Mr. Goldson was doing pupil teaching, I think, because he was called Master Philip. And I was either in ABC or 10 cents.
10 cents.
I skipped 5 cents.
Please explain what is 10 cents quickly so that the
ABC
students
now I
will
think
know
is
that.
kindergarten.
Uh-huh.
5 cents is standard
Infant one.
infant one, and 10 cents is infant,
Infant two. Get it? Easy, right?
So you know how long ago that was?
Okay.
But
You used to pay. Say that.
But
You-
I don't
you went
remember
free?
paying 10 cents.
Oh, well, Mrs.
I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe my mother paid it. I didn't.
Say quick.
Because you had to pay 10 cents a week for education.
It was not free.
So if I was in kindergarten, I wasn't paying? Because I don't remember paying. Maybe my mother did.
Maybe-
somebody
maybe,
must have
but-
paid, because I remember if you did not pay, a bill would go home to your parents to say that they owed so much money.
Right.
You know?
even
but
then-
that is why they call it that we went to 10-cent school.
Even then, you had to pay, right? Go ahead, Dr. Lewis.
So from 10 cents right up to standard 6 was
You get-
10 cents?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was either in kindergarten or 10 cents
Okay.
because I skipped 5 cents.
Okay.
Right? But I remember seeing Mr. Goldson with very thick spectacles, and that is the memory that I have of him because I didn't interact with him at that tender age. But I knew that he was one of the big boys who were being taught by R.G. Smith, who was the principal right at St. Mary's, and I knew he was Master Philip. I didn't really get to rub shoulders with him again until the Maritime Areas
Tell
Act
us
thing
about
came
that.
up. But just before that, my involvement with him really came after he was already blind. But I knew from what I was told that when he found out that he would probably be blind, and he must have been having a problem from way back when with these thick spectacles, he went and studied Braille.
Yes, he did.
So he didn't wait for the misfortune to come. He met misfortune with his plan, and he learned Braille. He had a typewriter. Now, I don't remember if the keys were in Braille or what, but he used, when in my time interacting with him, he would type what he wanted to be published. So he must have learned touch typing then too.
Remember, he was a journalist, though. So.
Yes.
And
So-
sometimes, he would make a little mistake in the typing, but then because, you could figure out what it was that he needed to say. He would put a letter in the wrong place, but you would know what the word is,
Right. And what I also learned was that he got himself a talking watch because he couldn't see the face of the
Right.
clock to tell the time, so the watch would tell him the time. This is what I call having vision, right? My experience with Mr. Goldson was that he was a person who had vision, even though he was blind. If you were sitting down and talking to him, you would never know he was blind because he covered everything. He had rich conversations on his veranda at his residence on South Street. One other thing for Mr. Humphreys, there is a publication called The Goldson Story. It is out of print, but I have a photocopy of all the pages. It was published in 1991, and there was always talk about getting the sequel to it written, but it was never written. So whoever wants to do it at least has something up to 1991, and then they'll have to research for beyond 1991. One other thing that I admire Mr. Goldson for, he went into politics poor, and he came out poor.
Yes.
Okay?
He never enriched himself.
No. Now, that brings me to the Maritime Areas Act.
Controversial
All right.
Maritime Areas Act.
When Mr. Goldson knew that it was being proposed, he put a notice in the Reporter saying that he wanted to start a discussion group about this thing. And anyone interested could please, come to the meeting. He was calling a meeting. And I went to the meeting, right? Because at the age of 18, and my husband was older, but at the age of 18, we marched in a No Guatemala thing, right?
We don't want no Guatemala.
And we paid the price, because my husband could not get any scholarship to go and study abroad, but we found a way around that, because where there is a will, there is an Eckert and Gilda. So he went away and studied and got his architectural qualification. And I used the opportunity to get my teaching qualification. No scholarship, no nothing, right? But so when he was up in arms about the Maritime Areas Act, I had some serious flashbacks, right?
Right.
And so I went to the meeting, and that is where it started. From the discussion group, we got to the point where we weren't yet a political party, but we called ourselves the Patriotic Alliance for Territorial Integrity. And even then, on my urging, we were careful about our acronyms, right? Because pups grow up and sometimes get rabies and stuff like that, right? But Patty, no one was knocking Patty for any reason. And we evolved, and when we decided we wanted to be a political party, because as a pressure group, you don't have much clout. And we went through all kinds of names, and I would tell them, remember the acronym thing, remember, right? So eventually we hit upon National Alliance for Belizean Rights. The acronym is NEIGHBOR, and really, I have not heard anybody knock that acronym yet, because we never did anything that was unneighborly, right? So, next point. I have a document signed by Mr. Goldson. This is one of my prized possessions. And I remember at one time, it wasn't yet the referendum commission. I think it was still the advisory committee on the Guatemalan claim, or the claim by Guatemala, ACGC. And we were talking about the same thing, what would Mr. Goldson do? And people were always wondering what would Mr. Goldson do. And I kind of remembered that I knew what he would do. But I don't believe in his story and her story, right? So I went into my neighbor box to search. I found this document way at the bottom of the box.
Let me just say before you speak about the document, when Dr. Lewis is talking about what would Philip Goldson do, she's talking about Guatemala's unfounded claim to Belize and how more or less how he saw it and how he thought it should be resolved. Go ahead, Dr. Lewis.
And because documents get lost, this is now, Nigel Encalada asked me to make a copy of it. So it's now at NICH, and it's now in Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. So if I have a fire or somebody decide to barack and disappear,
Burn down your house, there are other copies.
There are other copies. So this one came from the Patriotic Alliance for Territorial Integrity.
The precursor to NEIGHBOR.
And this is not signed. It just says signed Philip Goldson, Melvin Hulse, Derek Aikman, Hubert Elrington. But they were railing up about the Maritime Areas Act. And let me make this clear. NEIGHBOR never, ever, ever said they wanted the Maritime Areas Act repealed. Our position was always we want it changed. We want it amended to the median line. And that is where we are still. Because if we get any kind of settle, it will be the median line. But like I said, it won't be a straight line. When you look at the maps that were published during that time, they were showing a straight line down the middle from the mouth of the Saskatoon through the water, but it wouldn't necessarily go that way because it depends on the shape of the land and all of that. But it would be median every step of the way, right? So, when we talk about median, we need to make sure that people understand.
Right.
The second one was an open letter from Philip Goldson to the UDP members taking part in the UDP consultation and poll on the Maritime Areas Bill. And in here, he's talking about international law, right? We weren't focused on ICJ at that point, but that is where the international law takes place.
From the International
right?
Court. Yeah.
And this one is signed. There is his signature going up, like I said. So I don't talk her story. I talk documents. All right?
So let's make it clear. What is happening today, we saw it coming out of the Maritime Areas Act, and it's sort of like an excellent piece of foreshadowing. So put it in your words, what you think or how you see Mr. Goldson seeing the whole situation with Guatemala's unfounded claim and what we should do as a country.
Well, with his focus on international law, where is international law practiced? Could I ask the students that? Do you know where international law is practiced on behalf of the United Nations?
Students? Anybody in the audience? Any student? Where is international law practiced? ICJ, which means the International Court of Justice, right?
Right.
Okay.
Good. So if you don't go there, how do you get it solved? I'm hearing now that we should go back to the countries and the embassies that supported us when we were seeking independence and ask for their help. And if I was one of those countries, one of the 104 countries who voted for Belize to get its independence, Guatemala was the only country that voted against. And before that, there were several other UN resolutions. And every time the resolution was passed, it carried a statement, but go and settle the claim. So it's we who have to settle it, and we have to find the correct venue to settle it. If I was one of the 104 countries and Belize came to me to ask for help now because they don't want to go to the ICJ.
What would you say?
I'll tell you in a broad Creole.
Good.
Me don't tell you from 1981 that I support you, but go settle your thing. And you come back to me now with that same thing? What you want I do? Have I said it clearly?
Good point. Has it resonated, students or audience? I'm not hearing. Okay, thank you.
Hearing Mrs. Lewis and talking about Philip and the ICJ. Now, when he was living at that same South Street corner, he used to call me because I was working right down the street at the Anglican Diocese. And he would say, Mad, come now. He said, I want to talk with you. And one day when I went there, he said to me, say, you know, the only way we will be able to settle this dispute with Guatemala is to go to the ICJ.
Okay.
Now, I did not know anything about the ICJ. I need to confess that. So I said, ICJ, what are you talking about? And he explained to me what it was. So when I hear people now saying that Mr. Goldson never say, you must go to the ICJ, I can tell them that he told me that that is where we need to go to settle the dispute.
and I have it in writing with his signature.
So you concur too.
Yes.
So we all heard it.
May I ask Ms. Lewis to
Very
explain
quick,
to
'cause
us
we need
what
some
he
comments.
meant by the time to save your country is before you lose it? What he meant by that?
That you must take whatever action you can. One of the things he used to say is, suppose you were a baby and you can't talk. When the baby is dissatisfied about something, he make noise, he cry. So we have to make noise. But we must make noise constructively, not destructively. Okay?
Okay, so we already got the neighbor Goldson position on the matter. Do you have some last words, Dr. Lewis, before we open the floor for some questions and comments?
One of the things, because I am doing some real research, I'm a retired lady now, so I have time to do research, right? And there is a legal opinion by a Judge Manley. Judge Manley Hudson in 1950. The Guatemalan government retained him to give them advice on their Guatemalan claim to Belize. And his opinion ended up telling them they have no case, they will not win. So they have known from 1950 that they cannot win at the ICJ. Right?
Maybe that's why they constantly shift and move the goalposts.
Well, yes.
Every time we
yes.
make a decision to do certain things.
Yes, and delaying tactics. You see, if they brought up generations of Guatemalans and fed them on Belize es nuestro, how can they go back to those same people and say, sorry, we made a mistake, Belize no es nuestro?
Right.
Right. So there has to be a way to settle it. And as Assad Shoman said, Guatemala will not drop the claim, and Belize will not give up any land. At one stage, Guatemala wanted the whole thing. Then they wanted from Moho River, I think it was, to the Sarstoon. Then they wanted Monkey River to the Sarstoon. Then they wanted the whole of the Toledo district.
Yeah.
Then I think now they want from the Siboon to the Sarstoon, and all of the keys except St. George's Key. Right? And so there's only one place to settle that. Because if we don't, my great-grandchildren will still be fussing about this.
We continue this for generations.
We spent how many years already on it, and there's no resolution. But there is a place where it can be resolved. And I want to give you a quotation that I often use when I'm, trying to convince people of this or that or the other. There are 4 things that come not back.
Oh, I learned that.
The spoken word, the spent arrow, the past life, and the neglected opportunity. Thank you.
Let's not wait and cause it to be a neglected opportunity for
And one more thing.
our generations to come.
One more thing, because I say I do research, right? I go to the ICJ website and browse around every now and again. And I came across a judgment between, an ICJ judgment in 2008 in a case between Malaysia and Singapore regarding an island on which Singapore had built a lighthouse with permission from Malaysia, because from ancient times, Malaysia was the successor to the Sultan of Johor, whatever. So Singapore got permission to build a lighthouse. They put all the money, they did everything. They put all the naval stuff they needed there. And after 150 years, Malaysia published a map that showed the island in Malaysia's territorial sea. And Singapore wanted to clear that up. And so they had, listen to the word, they had talks, right? Talks led nowhere. And they submitted the case to the ICJ. Now, by all rights, if they had ancient title, it should be theirs, right?
Right.
Not so.
Right.
Singapore got the island, Because Malaysia had abandoned it. Did Spain abandon Belize?
Yes.
Singapore got the island because they acted as a sovereign. They passed laws, lighthouse laws and lighthouse tax and everything. Malaysia didn't make any protest. In fact, on one occasion when Singapore wrote to Malaysia to ask about this thing, the British official in Malaysia wrote back saying, Malaysia does not claim sovereignty. Well, the British, they perked up. And in one of their pieces of correspondence, they said, we can get this island. But it didn't get to that stage until Malaysia published the map, and the talks led nowhere. But they got the island because they acted as a sovereign. Can you imagine, and it happened in Belize too, one of the things in that case was that Malaysia had to ask permission if they wanted to go to the island for any reason. And sometimes Singapore told them yes, and sometimes told them no. And when they told them no, they couldn't go. In our legal opinion, there is reference to a case where a Guatemalan mayor or somebody, some official anyway, was asking permission to pass through Belize on the way to Mexico and was refused permission. Guatemala never protested about that, and the man couldn't go. So all of these things go into getting a resolution. And the ICJ, once they find a treaty that is valid, they don't really go looking anywhere else. In the case of Libya, Chad, they are quoted as saying that once a treaty involves a boundary, the treaty may die, but the boundary lives on. Okay? So I don't know what we're afraid of.
So thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Let's give her a hand and let's get your questions and your comments because time is against us.
I would want to make just one comment on what Dr. Lewis has said very articulately. And that is that one thing is very clear. The more we talk about the ICJ, the more we realize that the majority of our people are uninformed about this Guatemalan issue. And I think if there is a legacy for Mr. Goldson when it relates to young people, it is that they need to be educated on this matter. They need to dispassionately go through the details of how we got to where we are and why there is a strong opinion in part of our population to go to the ICJ, and there is equally a strong opinion about not going to the ICJ. Clearly, the feeling is going to the ICJ with the majority here, but I think we need to go through that education process and use, because I've read what happened in the case of Chad and Libya, and I've read in other areas.
You make your
and
point
we
quick, 'cause
really
we
need to educate, very much educate our people, and not just come to the conclusion that we have no other choice.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments? We have two roving,
let
no,
me just
Dr.
clear
Lewis, we
one
have
thing.
two roving microphones in the aisles. Just take up your position and I'll take your question and your comment to be directed to one of the panelists.
I was appointed to the National Advisory Commission in 2000. Shortly after that, our BDF people and police were kidnapped and taken into Guatemala, and so we were in crisis mode for a bit and couldn't get to the education aspect of what we were appointed to do. But after we got the people back, then with the OAS assistance, we came up with the confidence building measures. And I maintain that those confidence building measures show that Guatemala might have brawn, but Belize have brain.
Right.
So, but I was emotional in 2002. So when we were discussing this border and we're going to sign this thing, because Guatemala had already put into their constitution that there is no border, the treaty doesn't exist, we can't say border. And I'm banging on the table, Why? Why we have to do that? If you have to do that, then put border/adjacency line. Guatemala was not going to sign it. And we would still be shooting each other up because the confidence building measures have worked. Right? And so emotion,
While we're talking, we're not fighting.
Right. Emotion is not, you don't make decisions when you are in an emotional state, because if I was the person to make decision on the confidence building measures, at that time they would have died.
Right. Question? Somebody has a question, a comment? In front? Can we get the roving microphone? Okay. Myrna Manzanares. Thank you.
Hi.
Myrna, kindly stand, if you
I
can.
have to stand
If
up
you're
or
able.
grab the
Okay.
thing?
That's all right.
All right. I am very, very glad for this forum today because so many people don't know so many things. And right now, I have 2 books of Mr. Goldson, children's book, because they don't know nothing. But my question that I wanted to ask, and you kind of mentioned it, in terms of education, we have students here, and we have teachers here, and they have to understand that it was because of Mr. Goldson why that 10-cent education no longer exists for primary school. He eradicated the primary school education is free. If I'm wrong, please tell me. He also helped secondary schools with their education. And teachers, what he did that you did not have was money after retirement, some kind of retirement package. It was $300 back then, but he was the one who thought that, you know what, you work all of the years and you need to get something afterwards. So you as students and teachers have to recognize what this man did, what this great man did for teachers and for students, and never, ever forget it, because he was the one who helped us on our feet. The education was so important. So for me, please don't forget it. And you could dispute it if I'm wrong, but you're not going to do no research.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Anybody wants to elaborate on that? Here? Okay, next question, but thank you. Next question, comment? We tried to keep it tight in order to have had the high schoolers here, but that's how I was trying to keep it tight. Right.
Hello? Hi, upstairs. Okay. It's a question for your table, really. When looking at the governmental system now in Belize, what would you say Philip Goldson would have to say toward it, since you all know him so well?
When you say government, she said, when looking at the governmental system in Belize, what would you say Philip Goldson would have to say toward it, since you all know it so well? But what do you mean by governmental system? Can you elaborate there so that we could get a clear answer?
He was part of the governmental system.
We're hearing you. What do you mean?
The political system, now between the 2 parties, the disputes and everything, where we stand at the moment.
What would he have said now about the dispute, the Guatemalan dispute, where the 2 parties are concerned?
That is a waste of time. He can't answer you. We know what he said. We have his signature.
Understand the question.
I think I understand the question.
They're not sure about what you're asking. I'm not sure if you want to know how the dispute is being looked at by the 2 parties, how the UDP looks at it and how the PUP looks at it. Is it that?
No, the question has nothing to do with Guatemala, actually. It's just talking about how these 2 systems are working to improve Belize and the way they're dealing with the funds and different things like that.
Oh, she's talking about governance.
My reflection on it.
Just a minute. Governance with the 2 parties, how the country is working.
It wasn't a question, it was to the panel. And I would reflect and say that I think that Mr. Goldson would be very concerned with our governance process. I think that we have evolved to a point where we are seeing more and more of our representatives in both parties not having the conviction of these early pioneers, these persons who, as I'm not sure who said it, a man who goes into politics broke and comes out of politics broke, meaning that he didn't go in there to enrich himself. That is not what we see going on today. So I think Mr. Goldson would have a very serious problem with that.
Have proof.
I also think that Mr. Goldson stood for bringing the people into the conversation. I think you see that with the village council. You see that with so many other marginalized populations like disabled and others, that he made sure that their voices were heard. And I think that Mr. Goldson today would be very concerned. He would be one of those critics that is saying that we must ensure that power is with the people. And not just with a slogan, but in fact, that we are seeing our institutions ensuring that the opinions and the feeling of people is really out there. That's my reflection.
Mr. Esquivel wants to add something.
Yeah, no, I certainly would not dare to speak for Mr. Goldson. And I don't know that any of us here is qualified to speak for Mr. Goldson.
I shared in the House of Representatives with Mr. Goldson for many years, from 1961. In fact, I have been fighting from 1954 when they were elected. But what I found in Mr. Goldson, one of those virtues of few politicians, service above self.
Right.
Mr. Goldson never owned a palatial home. Mr. Goldson didn't own a vehicle. We used to share taxi for me and him to go to Belmopan and also to go to cocktail parties. Because Mr. Goldson was one of those persons that say, I will satisfy myself. He was one of the few, and I categorize George Price along that way, service above self. And that's what is lacking right now. I believe that's what's lacking in the country. That service actually is being done on the reverse. You serve me, politician.
It's service to self now.
Yes, you serve me. Then I will serve you. And that is the whole essence of it. And that's where governance right now. People are claiming, and that comes, as I said, from both political parties.
Okay.
From 1981, please. When they asked me when the problems began, I said 1981, the 21st of September. What? You they said that? Yes. Because freedom and liberty were mistaken. One was we gained freedom for the country, independence, but we did not get liberty to do as we damn feel like. Thank you.
Political independence. Thank you, Mr. Silva. We have a question. Imani, can you stand? No, the mic is not working. Is there another microphone quickly? Imani, come use this. I will repeat it then. I'll repeat your question. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I just want to thank BHA, Niche, and the panel.
There's a mic.
Good afternoon. I just want to thank the organizers, BHA, Niche, yourself, Anne, and the panel for a wonderful, wonderful session. As I listen, I can't help but ask, what was Goldson as a private individual? We often have public figures that we admire and respect, and you don't hear about their family life, the people who supported them unconditionally, the people who might have been victimized or hurt in the process of him being the activist and the revolutionary person that he was. And no one's isolated. They would have been loved. They would have loved people on a personal level. They would have had support. And so I would just encourage in whatever you're doing at the house to be created, that some recognition or acknowledgement be provided to his family and the people he loved and the people who supported him unconditionally.
Thank you, Imani. Well said. And I'm sure that will be done. Ms. Maud?
I just want to say that all that Philip did in politics, in his public life, the whole of it started, the genesis of the whole thing was his family. When, I can't explain to you in detail how he operated with his family when we were growing up and later with his own family. Everything for him was his family. And when he went into politics, he took this nation as his family. And that's why he operated in the way he did.
May I just remind Belizeans, north, south, east, west, there are two dates related to Mr. Goldson that have been ignored for so years. 25th of July, 1923, when he was born, and the 3rd of October, 2001, when he died. I have been harping. I'm a noisemaker on the television stations every morning, as everybody knows. I have been harping that I think Mr. Goldson should be given the same appreciation that Mr. Price is being given by his party. But this should be a national celebration by people on these two gentlemen that stood firm for Belize, service above self. 23rd of July, his birthday, I think something should be done. July.
25th,
And the 25th of July. And the 3rd of October, when he died, I believe that some group should go to his tomb as what they do for George Price and pay reverence to this man. I think we are falling on that. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Next question. Any other question or comments? Come.
Hi, good afternoon. It's not really a question, but more like a comment.
Okay.
I had the opportunity to go through a lot of old documents that used to belong to Honorable Philip Goldson, and I have to say that I personally did not know Honorable Philip Goldson, but going through those papers, it gave me a sense of getting to know him, like personally. The more personal side of Philip Goldson. I came across several papers. Papers that were written by people, by the public, people who would want to write to him, thanking him for some sort of any small favor that he would do. There was even this young girl, I think, I can't really recall the year, but she was attending St. John's Extension, and I guess one of the assignments was to write on a Belizean hero, and she decided to write on Philip Goldson. And just the fact that she had decided to write on him, I think it shows a lot that even from back then, like the affection that we had for Honorable Philip Goldson, and there's like so much little things that are really interesting as well. There's even old certificates for workshops that he attended. Like, we all know that he did major work with the refugees department. So he wasn't the kind of person who would just oversee things. He would involve himself in it and be a part of it. Because I came across the certificates and I was surprised because it was a bit funny as well, because he, as Minister of Labor and so on, he had to sign his own certificate. So that was pretty cool. And so I just wanted to add on to what everyone was saying, that there are a lot of papers that attribute to that, to Honorable Philip Goldson as a person, and a person that all Belizeans could relate to, that they didn't just see him as someone big, that he was someone that you could actually go and talk to and ask a favor for, and he would respond to. Because I also came across some letters that a Belizean abroad would write to him, and he would update the person with what was happening on Belize. So I think that's a really important and nice document that we have in our hands, that he's explaining to the person what was going on in Belize at that certain time.
Thank you very much. So, next comment, question?
Can I just
I have something that I want to add.
I just want to comment on what what she said in regards to and kind of what Imani said too.
And that will be your last question.
That personal side of Mr. Goldson. Mr. Goldson, like all politicians, came under a lot of personal attacks. very personal attacks. Everything from being called black monkey and all kind of very, very negative insults, which is still going on today, by the way. But Mr. Goldson survived that. He didn't allow that to penetrate and allow him to start thinking negative about himself. One of the things that they did to Mr. Goldson was to say that he was against independence, that he loved the British so much, that he wanted to walk around with the L and POB flag. But he explained in this interview that in fact that was propaganda, that in fact, why would he name his party the Honduras Independence Party if he was against independence? And when the HIP joined with the National Party and became the National Independence Party, he said it was independence that they held on to as the name. Yet people believe even today that Mr. Goldson was against independence, that Mr. Goldson was a colonialist and was fighting against independence. So he had a lot of personal attacks.
Thank you for that, Nuri. Myrna? Oh, we have one other question after Myrna then.
All right. All I wanted to say, somebody talked about the alliance abroad. Mr. Goldson, yes, he was the person who got all of us that were living abroad the Consortium for Belizean Development. And he made that happen. Absolutely. And to this day, there's still the consortium in the U.S., and those people are still really trying to ally with Belize. And we have to be the one to stretch out our hand so that they could vote. And the other last thing, that everybody in this country should always, I say, remember that Mr. Goldson is the one unique individual that we should always, always, always remember, because he did so many different things for all of us, and we should never forget it. All of our students should never, ever, ever forget.
Thank you, Myrna. Next, young man.
Good morning. My question is to Mr. Silva and to Mr. Esquivel. If we were strong about the Guatemalan claim, and our leaders rightfully said not an inch of grass, how is it that we have the Guatemala building on our side at the western border? Is it not the rivers that tell us, the boundaries?
No, sir. It is not the river. The river is in Guatemala.
But how is it that their immigration building is on our side and their military is walking on our side of the border?
No, because they are on the side which I'm saying that the boundary is on the land. Where they have a building is their territory. It is not the river.
May I explain that matter? Once the border, actually, Guatemala was on this side of the river, that did not mean that they were in Belizean territory. There are 3 monuments that were agreed upon by Guatemala and British Honduras then, in 1939, by the British, 1939, to survey the line between Gracias a Dios in the Sarstún, Garbot Falls near Benqueviejo, and Aguas Turbias by Corozal. That is the line that was known as the frontera, la frontera, that divided both countries, agreed upon by Guatemala and signed that was going to be the border. 1946, a president called Jorge Ubico came and said, no, I will not respect that border. But yet, they had an immigration and a customs all the time, so they respected it. No, the matter of the Sarstún is when, as Dr. Esquivel said, that's where they made that reference of a median line, middle of the navigable river Sarstún, not the shallow part of Sarstún. And so it has been recognized, and the monuments are there. Very old, but they are there.
Does that answer your question?
Not really, but take it.
But if you want another explanation, just say it. Just ask.
No, not really. I work with that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Can I add to that, please? I have a document here, not her story.
Oh. Go ahead, Dr. Lewis.
This document says the physical border with Belize does exist. It was published in the Belize Times on the 12th of March, 2000. And in this document, it is laying out how the Guatemalan government had a department that was funded and was clearing the border. So if they tell you there is no border, what in heaven's name were they clearing?
That's true.
Right.
And the British used to guard that same border with their
That's for you.
Thank you very much.
Young man, just explaining. There is in the border, every 3 kilometers, there's a called CAIRN, Kern. It is a bunch of stones so that that's where you recognize the borders. And they have been doing this recognition. They used to shoot chicleros from Cayo when they crossed the frontier. They used to shoot them from the tree or take them prisoner. So they recognized that Belize was an entity many years ago.
Thank you very much. If our closing clip is ready, let us play that before we have a wrap-up. You have a question? Okay.
No, I don't have a question. I just wanted
You
to
have a
respond
comment?
to the young man.
Oh, okay.
Because I think
Stand up and tell us who you are.
I'm Gian Vasquez. I'm the vice
Okay.
chair of the History Association.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to respond to that. I think there's a misconception in terms of where the actual building is. The building is in Guatemala. The line is drawn from what the gentleman up there is saying, from the markers, from one marker to the next marker. And so we run a straight line from those markers. And if you look at that territory, yes, it appears to be in Belize because you're using the river. But if you use the actual markers, that is in Guatemala. Similarly, the same thing occurs coming down the river because there is a portion that is across the river and it looks as though it is Guatemala, but it is actually Belizeans. And when you go to that farm, there are actually Belizeans there and no Guatemalans. So the misconception there is probably the river. The river isn't the dividing line. I hope that clarifies what you wanted to know.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vasquez.
A little final,
Let us
just
roll.
a final
We have to go,
clarification.
Mr. Silva.
The football field in Arenal, the line passed right in the middle of the football field. So when they're playing football, they cross the border without permit.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Silva. Let us play that clip and we come back very quickly. Don't move.
Do you have in terms of seeing Belizeans actively involved in the process of development, and what are your ideas behind to support this inclusion?
Well, as I said, it's my firm belief that it's in Belize's interest that Belizeans on the whole face of the earth should become involved in restoring their ownership of Belize, and should be involved in the management of the nation, in the making of policies, in serving in government, that we cannot, with a small population, fragment our human resources simply because of geography.
Okay. Mr. Goldson.
That's the clip that we're ending on, and that interview was done with Nuri, as you saw there, in 1991. Let me just say, in wrapping up, in 1989, our international airport was renamed the Philip S.W. Goldson International Airport. In 2001, he received the Order of Belize for his sterling contribution to patriotism and politics. And not to be outdone, he received posthumously in 2008 Belize's highest honor, certainly worthy of his sacrifice, the Order of National Hero. And 2 years ago, the Northern Highway was renamed the Philip S.W. Goldson Highway. I, too, had an opportunity to interact with the late Philip Goldson. I found him to be very erudite, very knowledgeable about any and everything. And I just want to thank you all for coming out today, and for you to constantly continue to remember and rediscover the life and legacy of the late Philip Stanley Wilberforce Goldson, July 25, 1923 to October 3rd, 2001, one of our national heroes. Good afternoon and have a great rest of the day.
Your daddy was Peter Goldson. I buy my first 50 Rhode Island soccer from my father, Kyle, because there was no menu like saying, you have to go get
I know.
you have to go buy your chicken. So I buy 50 bullets and I carry them.
Hello. Okay. Well, we have come to the end of the program. I would like to express on behalf of the Belize History Association our gratitude for the opportunity and the honor to showcase the life, memory, and legacy of the Honorable Philip S.W. Goldson, our national hero, true Belizean patriot, champion of workers' rights, journalist, and father of Belizean democracy. A special thank you, firstly, to the family of the late Honorable Goldson for sharing his wonderful spirit with the nation of Belize. And I will go on to say thank you to our panelists, the Right Honorable Sir Manuel Esquivel, Mrs. Maud Williams, Mr. Nuri Mohammed, Mr. Hector Silva, Mrs. Gilda Lewis, our moderator, Ms. Anne-Marie Williams, Mr. Francis Humphreys, Chair of the Belize History Association, Ms. Diane Haylock, President of NICH and Chair of the September Celebrations Committee, Mr. Nigel Encalada, who I'm sure is hiding because he doesn't like thank yous. He is the director of the ISCR. Him, along with Rolando Cocom, Giovanni Pinello, and Irene McCoy. I want to specifically single them out because without them and their capacity, we would not be functioning as the Belize History Association. So, as a member of the History Association, I personally, and on behalf of my colleagues sitting in the front, Mr. Gian Gandhi, Deputy Chair, Gian Vasquez, my sincere apologies. Caught up in a moment. Gian Vasquez, Vice Chair of the History Association. We all want to say thank you. Without them, this would not be possible. To Reverend Goff, Miss Jael Nicholas, students, teachers, and citizens present, and to all our listeners tuned in. And of course, thank you to Creme Radio and Television, Love FM, radio and television. Without you all, people who are not here, not able to be here, would not be able to have access to this wonderful roundtable discussion. I, in ending, would like to encourage all my fellow Belizeans to use the month of September to dedicate ourselves to get to know Belize. Let us not forget the struggles and victories of the Battle of St. George's Key, of independence. Belize, renewed. Confident, competitive, and committed. Long live Belize. Happy September celebrations, everyone. I also want to put one final comment in here. I was advised by the president of NICH that the government of Belize has purchased the house of the late Honorable Philip Goldson Belmopan. NICH has worked to make that house into a museum. It will be officially inaugurated and opened on the 15th of September, 2015. I invite you all in our most patriotic month to visit and take a look and get to know Mr. Goldson, a father of democracy and one of the true fathers of this nation. Thank you. Have a good holiday.
It was the 10th day of September.